So before I start this video, I'd like to make some confessions. This topic was really hard for me to write about. Not only because I have a white male perspective on things and have benefited a lot from my status in this world on this topic, but because originally when I made this idea, I was supposed to cover all of the American topics and how they're whitewashed. But upon doing some more research, I discovered that I can really only talk about history and only to a small, sparse degree, and that it really isn't proper for me to discuss most of the things in this video because, well, I just don't have the true experience of it. So going forward, I'd like to note that this was very hard for me to write for a lot of reasons, but it's going to be a little more off the cuff and a little more scatterbrained because there is a lot to cover here. That being said, I'd like to welcome you to Episode 3 of the All-American Nightmare, Whitewashing the Dishwater, or as I like to call it, American History, the mythos of the white people. It's often said by archaeologists that history, and the study they're in, is the search for fact, not truth. If you're interested in truth, try philosophy. History is also written by the victors. More accurately, history is written by the conquerors. And we have to understand that when you talk anything about history, that when you read a book or a text or anything, you have to read a variety of perspectives, even from people you don't like. This is because, in a lot of ways, history is shot from multiple perspectives. People who have the money and power to have history written about them aren't going to allow someone to depict them as evil or racist or as an imperialist, colonialist slaver. They're going to try and depict themselves in the best light possible because, well, they have an ego. Just in the same regard as other detractors might publish some truths, but they'll be more interested in tearing down the idea and tearing down the concept. So, in a lot of ways, we try as hard as we can, but bias will always creep in. That's why when it comes to history, you usually have to take a lot of different sources, boil them down, and try to create a real opinion out of it. And I did that here. To confess, this was a really hard subject to talk about. Number one, because I'm a white male, and I have benefited extremely well from the history of my country and culture. But that being said, this also opened my eyes to a lot of the horrors that were going on. I was constantly having to rewrite notes and rewrite scripts because new information would come forward that I had no idea about that would make me change my opinions and worldviews on a lot of things. I've attached below a series of sources, mostly books and documents that some people can check out if they'd like to find out about this, but I also encourage you to continue discussing, well, where history goes wrong and where history is corrected. I'm also going to try and avoid a lot of pointing out specific examples in this because the examples that are frequent of America's mistreatment of its history and its mythologizing of its past tend to be quite numerous, and I could go on for hours. And to be frank, I'm wanting to keep these videos more or less short. So with that out of the way, welcome to Episode 3 of the All-American Nightmare, Whitewashing the Dishwater, or a more proper title, American History, the mythos of the imperialist colonialist. If you open up any American history textbook, you'll probably be greeted with a entry-level understanding of where Americans started and how we came to this country. And it'll probably realize something out of a fairy tale. A young, plucky band of people trying to escape religious persecution came to this virgin wilderness to dig their feet into the soil and tried as hard as they could to fight against all odds to become these grand, radical people with a source of enlightenment and truth and leading the world in all power aspects. The plucky underdog succeeds and becomes the hero of the land. When in reality, America had been known about for a very long time, and the people that settled here, predominantly in the New England colonies, were a pack of economically aggressive, racist, imperialist colonialists who were more interested in driving the people from their land, breaking trade agreements, virus bombing the native populations, taking up squatter rights in areas that didn't belong, stealing property and concepts, systematically replacing or substituting the native populations that they didn't just outright kill. And essentially, American history is not so much this clean storybook you tell your children at night. Rather, it's a blood-stained narrative that it reads like a horror novel. But, that type of information just complicates the narrative. So why is American history so mythologized? Why do we have this value of a story time book you can tell your children before bed instead of a horribly complicated history about the flaws of American design. Well, it happens for a variety of reasons. As I said in the beginning, history is written by the conquerors, and certainly for the longest time, the only people that were creating to the historical aspects of America were the rich and powerful. Even as far as our country goes, modern education really is only a new common aspect, and correctional history is also even more newer. Only recently have we started going back through history and using evidence such as DNA tracing, record finding, and, Ancestry.com to learn about the true horrors of American aspects. If you ever watched the show Roots, one of the common things that a lot of the people on the show, celebrities, famous people, scientists, have is when about the time the Civil War comes about, they're always really concerned upon which side of the Civil War they fought. And this is because they want to be on the side that wins. We have past tense that we know how the Civil War ends. We know that the Civil War was a pack of slavers who wanted to uphold the values of slavery in their country rather than fighting for any idea of states' rights. This is very telling of American mythos, that everybody wants to be the plucky underdog who came from simple roots to achieve their greatness, not some type of entrenched system that benefited off of human suffering. Elon Musk is a popular example where a lot of people like to believe that Elon Musk is this strong-willed American person who, through his own hard work and determination, built a multi-billion dollar, he's not a trillionaire yet. As of this video, he's not a trillionaire. Trillion-dollar empire that now improves private space flight and sending cars into space. When in reality, Elon Musk is a very intellectually dull person who had a family that benefited off apartheid slavery at emerald, silver, and diamond mines in South Africa. But not a lot of people want to talk about that because it ruins the idea. It ruins the American value. And that's one of the key things that makes American history so mythologized. Well, it's three things, actually. The first is values. What we put as a prominent American value. Well, if you ask most Americans, that is to say most white Americans, what are some really important values of America? Well, freedom, democracy, the American dream, hard work, and patriotism. These are all nice, but they don't really tell us much. And these are values we ascribe to a lot of people. The Founding Fathers were these Enlightenment thinkers from the Renaissance who had the ideas of freedom, liberty, and truth enshrined in their Constitution. It reads like a hero of old, doesn't it? But that is a direct quote out of the book American History, the Great American Pageant. That's in an actual textbook I just read, just so we all understand that. It depicts George Washington as this grand, universal person who was a Renaissance man and a thinker and a just, kind person who knew the values of democracy. When in reality, George Washington was a terrible tyrant, a horrible tactician who actively held farmers at the point of a gun and demanded taxes, instituted a law into the Bill of Rights that literally was designed to put down slave rebellions, and was more than likely a pederast. I kid you not. But like I said, those types of facts just complicate the narrative, don't they? Another core component of the American imperialist system is value, what we put values on. If you ask a lot of white people what are some American values, or how do we establish someone's worth, they'll assign something like, well, a person has a lot of material wealth. If a person has a lot of money and a lot of materials, they're obviously a hard worker who deserves what they have. If you ask them, what are some American values? Well, patriotism, someone who defends their country against the other threats there far and abroad. Someone who gives up what they have to help others. Someone who puts their country's needs first ahead of their own. And if we ask them who they venerate in American culture, another prime aspect of this mythos, veneration, they might tell you someone like, oh, George Washington, the Founding Fathers, or perhaps a more modern person, Donald Trump, for example. I'm sure if you ask a lot of people who a great American is, they'll tell you Donald Trump. But if we ask them about other famous people, or we try to bring up to the attention that, these values and value and veneration they're attributing to these people, Founding Fathers, Donald Trump, Abraham Lincoln, Jefferson Davis in some cases, we find out that they don't exactly appreciate the truth of the aspect, rather that they want their heroes to remain heroes, not villains that they actually are. And this is another aspect of American imperialist history and the mythologizing. The mythos only works if your figure remains a myth. If your figure is brought out of this higher than thou art system into being a simple, flawed human being, it tends to ruin things. For the example of the lost causers myth, people who think that the Civil War was fought over states' rights, if you actually sit there and discuss with them the numerous problems with the South, the issues of slavery, and many other things, they'll constantly either downplay the aspect of things, they'll deflect blame onto other people, or they'll pivot and try to talk about something else. They are trying to keep their mythos alive. They want to keep their heroes as heroes. This goes a long way towards a common trend in American history, what has been deemed cancel culture, but in reality is academia taking responsibility for its actions, correcting historical inaccuracies. Many people will claim that Confederate statues can't be taken down in America because that's how we uphold our history and our nation. But in reality, these are statues to slavers, imperialists, aggressive economic powerhouses. People that, according to our values and venerations, shouldn't exist. And yet, people want to keep them alive. Because they're not ready to confront the idea that they've been lied to all their lives and that they've been perpetuating a very, very evil system for a very long time. So American history, now calling it American mythology isn't exactly incorrect, but American history is heavily mythologized. So what? We know that. People of color are already well versed in this, and there's plenty of videos out there on YouTube, Facebook, social media, what have you, that actively show where this is an issue. But how did it get to this point? How did the imperialist system weasel its way into our consciousness without us knowing about it? Well, there's a couple primary reasons why it got in. The first and foremost is the textbooks. Now, I know you guys probably don't know this, but textbooks are actually not purchased by a school board directive. It's not like there's a store you go to where you can purchase said textbooks. In a lot of cases, this going back to prepackaged curriculums, if you purchase a curriculum from a company, you get the textbook that the company made. It's a proprietary textbook. We actually have laws against doing this in a lot of different cases for other companies, but for some reason when it comes to education, we totally allow this. So, you purchase a curriculum, sometimes you automatically get the textbook. And this is one of the things I critiqued in my second video, where I said that if we have a company making you a curriculum, we have no idea what that company is teaching or how it pertains in. And if their textbook is heavily audited and modified, you get stuck with that. We also have a problem with textbooks being sourced. So textbooks are made by publishing companies and are typically written not so much by experts coming together in a committee, but they take a lot of information, they do the research, and they funnel it down into a set system. That being said, if whoever is being given the textbooks to disseminate them out and write them is being given information strictly from biased sources, well, that textbook's going to reflect that. And of course, the other thing too is there is a motivated interest to get your textbooks purchased. Just as in science and STEM fields, scientific papers are a big metric by how we value your scientific worth. Textbooks are another thing. If you get picked to write in a textbook, that's a lot of academic clout. And in doing that, people are kind of motivated to write textbooks that favor certain opinions around the country. For example, the textbook I received in high school was called The American Pageant. It pretty much stopped in 1990. And when I was learning history was, I think, my sophomore year in high school. That was 2010, 2011. Which is not very, helpful. That essentially 20 years of history weren't engaged with. 20 years of history that I would actually kind of have some connection to. The American Pageant has been reviewed by multiple medical groups, independent contractors, several scientific analyses, and it received a poor rating in terms of historical accuracy, even for the time frame it was written in. Also, at the time I got the book, it was about 5 years out of date, but was published back in the 1980s. So I was essentially using a book that was almost 40 years old and at least 25 years out of date by the time I got to it. But it was favorable to the middle-class, white, heteronormative schooling system that I was based in. My principal, who helped pretty much pick up the textbooks and had a hand in everything, approved this book. He was also a virulent racist who believed in independent rights, or states' rights during the Civil War, so figure that out. Whereas we go down to the Deep South, a lot of history books that even go so far as to state that the Civil War was fought anywhere around slavery are just outright ejected from schools. And this has a lot to do with numerous groups, PTAs, school boards, what have you. So if we have people with preset biases picking our textbooks, instead of a federal standard for textbook writing or an official textbook authoring system, you're kind of already starting on a downhill slope. The next thing, too, is that this goes back into a subject I'll discuss later on, but I also discussed in my second episode, that some schools don't receive a lot of funding. They can't go out and purchase brand new textbooks, not en masse anyway. So what a lot of schools have started doing, and this is only recently, within the past 10 to 15 years, is they've started doing, allowing children to use social media and technology to do histories instead of a textbook. Foregoing the textbook entirely for kind of a 5-alarm chilly, go out there and do your own independent research. And this is great. This is actually what we should be doing with history. Children should be allowed to go out and find their own sources, disseminate the information, and do their own research. That's what's part of academia, going out and doing the field work and doing the research, and getting the sources, learning how to citate them, learning how to compile the information, and put it into a discussion. Basically what I do here. And with technology, that is more capable than ever to do that, and it's great to see some schools preferring this method. This is a really big step forward. The issue is that in a lot of schools I was discussing with both multiple high school age students, all of which were, I did have permission to record them, but because of HIPAA laws and security violations and ethical considerations, I'm not going to include them in this topic discussion. But I had reached out to a lot of high school students. They informed me of something called Websense, or a Nanny program. What Websense and Nanny programs are essentially censorship systems that schools can upload to their computer drives. So when you go into the computer lab, if you search certain things, it will block it off. Now, the theory behind this is so kids aren't, messaging predators over the internet or selling drugs or looking up porn or playing games, what have you. Which, all in all, is kind of pointless now that kids all have smartphones and LTE and what have you, but, that's a discussion for a different day. The bigger issue we started finding out with these Websense programs is that I gave a couple of students some people to look up on Websense, famous notable people from history. Henrietta Lacks, Jefferson Davis, Abraham Lincoln, Lee Harvey Oswald, Jack Ruby, people like that. They were blocked from searching a lot of those sites, and when it came to historical discussions, there were some cases where they couldn't look up articles that were critical of slavery in the Civil War on race theory. There were subjects that were critical of the treatment of the First Nation peoples and the Trail of Tears. There was sites that basically had Westward Bound Manifest Destiny completely blacklisted. So it's impossible to let kids discover their own information and learn about history if we're just going to turn around and censor everything they see to keep it nice and kosher. And like I said earlier, I totally understand the idea that some history just can't be taught to young children. 8-year-olds can't understand generational trauma or the deep-seated issues of slavery. But when kids are in high school, the time where we should be actively trying to get them to understand the horrors and realities of history, and we're actively shutting off what they can and cannot see, it sends a completely opposite message to what we are trying to do. In fact, I'd say go far as counterintuitive. And here's the thing with this. Not every student has a smartphone to go do their information. Not every student has internet resources at home where they can go and look up stuff and write papers at home. That's why we institute time in school for kids to do that. That being said, what happens if a kid goes online and finds sources, but then they have to go back to those sources in school and they can't figure them out because of a Websense program? Having a literal system designed to censor people really doesn't help anybody. It mostly just causes us to be more ingrained and more entrenched with the established belief systems. There's an old saying about history. History should make you feel uncomfortable. History should make you feel upset. History should terrorize you and horrify you and make you feel a variety of feelings. Because that's the purpose of history. Because if you understand those feelings, you won't commit to the same mistakes. And no offense, but watching the news at 5 o'clock anymore, there's a lot of mistakes that keep happening because of this. Another one of the big reasons why history seems to be more mythologized tends to be with media. Now, not so much with social media, because social media does have the benefit of having some degree of pushback and free speech of idea or free market of ideas, but more or less in media like movies, magazines, and books. One of the common things you might notice about books and movies about the Civil War is their idyllic portrayal of both sides of the conflict, and they strike a very clear bias. A common joke with a lot of movies that come out from pure flicks or from predominantly Christian-based organizations is that they often push way too much a biased source or biased view of things instead of focusing on telling a story. And that's how a lot of people do get their information out. Just as the popular film, Gods and Generals, is a story about the Civil War that depicts the South as this idyllic, lemonade-sipping, easygoing people of Jeffersonian economics. And in the entirety movie about the Confederacy and the Civil War, there is but 3 black people depicted, to my knowledge. And the most racist sentiment comes from the Union armies using probably one of the softer pejorative slurs used against black people in the Civil War period. And to be real, it's only used once. There is a Civil War movie out there that depicts Stonewall Jackson as this man fighting against all odds, and there's no black people in it, and a racial slur is used once by the Union. But people watch this movie, and that's how a lot of them get their understanding of history. For example, the Tuskegee Airmen, probably not a lot of people knew about them and the Red Tails until the movie came out. Henrietta Lacks, I love asking people if they know who Henrietta Lacks is, and until people pretty much go and Google her, they don't know who she is because she's never had a movie or a cinematic piece done about them. Same thing with Hidden Figures. Not a lot of people knew about the African American women who helped NASA get us to the moon until that movie came out. This is kind of the issue. Most people don't actually learn or get engaged with history on the modern day through a textbook and through schooling. They get it through their media forms. As a result, it's often filmmakers pushing biased sentiments that get people to understand them. When you watch movies about Ronald Reagan, you either see 2 things. An idyllic portrayal of a man who was trying his hardest to help America in crisis and at the heat of the Cold War, as we see most recently with Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War, where Ronald Reagan is merely seen as a operating figure of a black operations unit who just does what he has to do. Or you watch movies about Ronald Reagan where he's depicted as essentially Satan, because, yeah, he pretty much was. Not only sending the LGBT community to be ravaged at the face of the AIDS epidemic without calling it the AIDS epidemic for 4 years or even addressing it, also implementing huge economic policies that gave way for the rich to plunder America's resources, and spawning the super predator myth against people of color to perpetuate the drug war. Yeah, Ronald Reagan was a very controversial person, but if you watch movies, you don't get that sentiment. You always get his biographies are always listed as these beautiful things, that he was trying his best, and that's how people remember Ronald Reagan. Imagine what happens when we go about American history. How many movies have come out that decry the treatment of Native American people that are actually historically accurate? How many films have come out decrying the treatment of African American slaves? Hell, there are some movies that don't even base themselves on it, but are just talking about it. The end line in Black Panther, where I do believe Kilgore, or the main antagonist of the movie, says, "Toss me in the ocean that I might be buried with my ancestors." There are people who literally dedicated 42-minute YouTube rants to explaining why that was a complete, BS line, when in reality, if the person was a black man in America, even if he had roots back to Wakanda, yeah, there's a good chance his ancestors were on slave ships. That's just demonstrably known. But again, it breaks up the mythos. We see ourselves as the villains in this movie, that we were the ones who caused this. And that's a big telling thing. Another big issue is the systemic defunding of schools. Now, this is an issue I'm going to talk more in depth on a different episode, but for right now, I'll give you a little teaser. A lot of money that goes to schools through levies and funding doesn't actually get its way to schools. As the old saying goes, if you drop a gallon of water on top of a tree, only but the smallest drops hit the bottom. This is because every level of education that goes through takes a small piece out of the money given to them. This is why schools are always so dependent on levies and funding, and why teachers are so critically underfunded and overworked and underpaid in a lot of ways. Because the system is not designed to funnel as much money into the school as it can. This is how you get kids that don't have access to computer labs, or the computer lab is an incredibly limited resource, so they have to use textbooks. The school doesn't have enough funding to get proper textbooks or to purchase textbooks that are up to date and up to snuff, so they usually either purchase backorder textbooks that were given away by other schools for the reason of it was out of date, or they have to purchase the cheapest textbooks on offer, which, by the way, tend to be the most historically inaccurate ones. Go figure. If you don't put enough money into the research, you don't get a really good research product out of it. Once again, we're bringing back economics into schooling. So this is a big thing too. Not to mention that programs that tend to promote these types of historical corrections typically aren't well funded. They're either seen as exploratory classes, i.e. something along the lines of African American studies, or Black American history, or even Native American history, or studies of First Nation tribes, is systematically defunded every step of the way. I'm living in Seattle, and one of our big critical parts of the state history we teach children is about the First Nation people and the various tribes and how they came to be. We have a really good relationship with the tribe, so in a lot of cases we can actually go and talk to these tribal representatives, and they can actually come to the schools and teach us about their ways and about their tools and about their history. But every time we bring this up in meetings or budgets, it's always one of the first things to be systematically attacked by defunding. Oh, we can't afford to have them here, despite the fact that it's mostly volunteer work, and despite the fact that children love learning about this history, and especially when the Native American people come here in their regalia and walk us through the stories and the dances and the actual process of how their tribe operate. It's a really educational thing, and it's one of my favorite times to learn with children. The problem is that a lot of times it's tried to be defunded left and right because it doesn't suit the narrative. Not to mention, there has also been times where the First Nation people have, I've always allowed this, lots of teachers actually allow this, but there are certain groups that tell them, pretty much they give them a script when they come into the school and tell them you can't talk about certain subjects because it might upset the children. In reality, it just would upset their worldview. I'm not going to lie, I'm not going to state the specific schools that I've known about doing this. You can go and Google it for yourself. But let's bring up another good point about that. Another reason why we have a lot of imperialist systems still teaching children is because of PTA groups. Again, another topic I'll get into in a different discussion. The PTA is more of a special interest group, and they have a dedicated interest in going through school curriculums and editing what teachers can and cannot teach in a lot of states. Washington, I have to unfortunately admit, does have this problem. We have a lot of PTA involvement. And if you have something like the 1619 Project coming in, a lot of people won't like that because they'll think that it's attacking their preferred worldview. They don't want to come to terms with the fact that they've benefited from this imperialist colonialist system. As a result, they're not going to allow something that challenges them come into school. You will never see parents and teachers and the established authority fight harder and longer than when its very roots of its implementation are being questioned. This is typically why these groups that favor the American mythos are often anti-intellectual free spaces or downplay the effect of intellectual properties in academia. Again, I'm not going to say who, but you can pretty much know who I'm talking about. I just don't want to get sued or taken down. The final point I want to bring up too is that teachers kind of in a way do perpetuate this, and not by their own fault. Yes, are there some teachers out there that have white supremacist or, maybe some imperialist colonialist rhetoric? Of course. We've grown up with that in our life as background radiation. I'm not going to pretend that my life and my opinions and my worldviews aren't directly related to that being part of my upbringing as the societal norms. And I do fight that every day. And even there are some days where I unintentionally do make comments that say something along the lines of being an imperialist rhetoric. And I always apologize for that because it's wrong. It's incorrect. I shouldn't be enforcing that will upon people that I exploit. And that's all it really takes, is to just apologize and correct yourself. But a lot of teachers don't have the ability to teach these nuances. A lot of teachers are so stressed and pushed to the point that picking the modem of most efficiency works. And I am in no way blaming teachers here. If a teacher is working 80-hour weeks with very little pay, or their pays are being locked down because of school bureaucracy, they're constantly being yelled at by parents, the students are causing whatever problems they are, and they're critically understaffed, under-resourced, and under-financed, I can understand why a cheap, quick, fast curriculum would be so damn appealing to them. And I hold none of them accountable. They're being preyed upon and exploited in this imperialist system, just as that's its main purpose. It exploits people. So in a way, teachers being so stressed and drawn to the edge has caused them to adopt this imperialist system that is so easily applied and easily brought in. And I don't blame them for it. Again, I really want to stress that. I don't blame people for doing this, but we do contribute to it. I myself contributed to it. The fact that a lot of the information I learned about this article, or this subject, I got from the articles and subjects, I had to source from people of color. And that was totally upon me. I didn't really want to put the stress in to go get it. I ended up asking them for help in a lot of ways. And that was me benefiting from my imperialist standing. That I got to make them educate me, instead of myself educating myself. And granted, I had plenty of time to do this, and I still did it. So, yeah, something to address on my behalf. So now, time for the call to action, or the corrective. How do we fix that? Well, fortunately, this system is kind of correcting itself. I'm just here to kind of update things. So, number one, schools are moving away from education through textbooks and more to education through independent researching, the 5 alarm chiller approach. I myself did this. When I was actually teaching for the year that I told students we're not going to use the textbook. The textbook will be our general guide for where we need to be and when, but we're going to be using our smartphones, we're going to be using laptops, we're going to be doing research outside. Lots of different methods to come forward to actively get a grip on the education. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is inspiring students to go out there and spread their information. Hopefully, with these podcasts and videos I make on the subject, children will be inspired to go and make their own videos and tell the world about their learnings and make video essays. One of the things I did this with my teaching is, during Black History Month, I told students that they each had to pick an individual person, a famous person of color, preferably from their own heritage. I mean, obviously, I wanted to make sure that First Nation people could go after First Nation people for a subject, or Latinx people go after Latinx people for a subject. That was perfectly acceptable. They could go out and pick these people and do video essays, talk about their life and times, kind of do a little mini podcast episode. They could do essays, they could do video essays, they could do raps. I had a student who wrote a rap song about General Mondragon, which I didn't even really know about him besides the rifle, and I was really fascinated by the subject. But allowing children to not only learn about their people and their culture and their heritage, but to express the idea and get out in public and use their other skills they have to inspire them. That's a great way to get students learning about history and engage with history. That's what I mean when I say make history fun. Make history fun for the students. Another good point we can have is to stop forcing all of the different diversity systems out into exploratory classes and bring them whole as a part of American history. Overhaul the American history system. That is to say, things like the 1619 Project is a really big thing I'm pushing. It does incorporate a lot of the people of color into its history that have been systematically, either intentionally or unintentionally, mostly intentionally, excluded from American history for the longest time. That's another good way we're doing this. The final thing is a personal note for myself, and that is when you have students that want to come up to you, I mean, this is going up to teachers. If you have students that come up to you and want to talk about certain things that go on during the period you're learning about, let's say you're turning about the 1920s and some student comes up and says, man, I don't want to hear about Prohibition. I want to talk about jazz and the Harlem Renaissance and the explosion of arts and culture in Nolans. Don't tell them no. Try to either focus that into a project they can work on or incorporate it into your lessons. This is me actively telling teachers, go out there and watch YouTube videos on historical subjects such as Altuche films, Simple History, History Redefined, things of that nature. Go out there and use outside sources and bring them in. Students don't want to sit in a classroom all day reading books. A lot of students would benefit from watching a short YouTube video to kind of prime them for the history lesson they're going to learn. And most of those videos are like 5-10 minutes, so you can totally get them done in a class period. And those resources are free and accessible. And hopefully with students going out there and expanding upon this, we'll have even more resources. We'll build the knowledge and build academia. That's kind of what I'm hoping for here. Anyway, like I said, this was a big topic to go over. I had a lot of issues getting this started. I've probably redone this video about 6 and 7 times, trying to get it right, because I didn't want to seem too preachy, but I also didn't want to reach outside my wheelhouse or step outside my bounds in terms of being white, being a male, and preaching to people who might already know things. That being said, I would like to appreciate you all for spending this time with me, this hour, half hour. And I would now like to go into 2 small updates and a thank you. The first update will be for my next episode of The All-American Nightmare. Unfortunately, due to legal reasons, I was collecting a lot of information on prepackaged curriculums. McGraw-Hill and South Company did not get back to me at all on their prepackaged curriculums or what I could see. So I started having teachers and students that I sourced come and give me scans of their documents so I could kind of show off what this prepackaged curriculum looked like. And I was informed by one of the teachers that essentially, because I would be redistributing the work, I could be sued by McGraw-Hill or some of these companies. So I've had to completely forego the next episode as a prepackaged curriculum. I simply don't have any evidence to go on, and I don't have enough clout to justify me doing a proper investigation, but I will try to link some information to people who have done that, if I can. The other thing, too, is that I've replaced that episode with what is called Fascism Factory, or A Machine for Pigs, where we'll be discussing America's essentially turning schools into factories for fascism in the post-9/11 decade. That I feel will be very interesting to children who, like me, grew up either at the tail end of 9/11 or were very young at 9/11, or alternatively students that were not born yet. So instead, I apologize, I'm going to deviate from that, but instead of prepackaged curriculum or curriculums to go, we will be learning about a machine for pigs. And that being said, I'd like to give a special thanks to the various people who helped me with these writing of this episode in both consultation and acceptance. Those people would be Curtis Whitlow, Professor Megan Daughtry, Professor Stacy Ann Codico, Amanda Hernandez, Geraldo Alvarez, Kendra K. Cheyenne, Lucinda Gonzalez, Mary Jo Gonzalez, Winthrop Arthright, Professor Winthrop Arthright, excuse me, Professor Megan Dawson, and John Whitaker. I'd also like to incorporate the 3 books that I use as my primary readings in this. That would be Blue and Gray Democracy, Lies My Teacher Told Me, and White Fragility. I will also include a few discussions into the topics and sources I used to initially source this in the description below, but because most of my readings are about education and processes to move around, this is more open-ended, so there's not as many citations within. I feel stating that there's the imperialist narrative is so commonly understood in general, you could call it the same as, rain falls, fire burns, sky's blue. Anyway, thank you for your time with me. I'll see you on the next episode of All American Nightmare. Have a good day.